Morning, everyone. We're just giving Zoom a moment or two to add everybody into the room, and then we'll get started in just a second. Okay, hopefully everybody has had a chance to be added into the room. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Welcome to this Duke Media briefing on the upcoming election. I'm Gregory Phillips with Duke Media Relations and Public Affairs. Both presidential candidates have poured millions of dollars into North Carolina, which is considered a swing state this year, despite having gone Republican for president in 10 of the last 11 elections. We have 4 Duke experts with us today to discuss the upcoming election and some of the factors that may influence the result in the election for president and other offices here in North Carolina. With us today is Kerry Haney. He's a professor of political science, professor of African and African American studies, and dean of the social sciences at Duke. Haney researches race and politics, Southern politics, and comparative urban politics. Also joining us is Sunshine Hilligus. She is a professor of political science and public policy who studies American political behavior, including young voters, campaigns and elections, survey methods, public opinion, and information technology and politics. And we have Asher Hildebrand. He's an associate professor of the practice at the Sanford School of Public Policy. He served for nearly 15 years in congressional offices and on campaigns and studies American politics, civil participation, democracy and governance, and US foreign policy. And also joining us is Mac McCorkle. He is a professor of the practice at the Sanford School of Public Policy and was an issues consultant to Democratic political candidates, state governments, and others for more than 25 years. Good morning to all of our panelists. Professor Haney, we'll start with you. There's been a lot of discussion in recent years about how changing demographics in North Carolina and across the South will eventually start to influence elections here. How much of a role do you think those changes could have in this election?
It could be the difference in the election in North Carolina this year. Let me start with going back to Georgia in the last election, 2020, and we saw that President Biden won Georgia. North Carolina may be beginning to look like Georgia in terms of demographics, in terms of racial and ethnic demographics, but also the number of people moving into the state from the outside. There's been a change in the population quite a bit since the last 4 years, over the last 4 years. And that could be enough to make North Carolina trend from purplish to blue. It's a purple state. It's been contested in the last couple of election cycles. I think it'll be close in this state. But the demographic shift could be enough to give a slight advantage to Harris. And there's some other factors I would add to that later that make that advantage even clearer.
Absolutely. Thank you. Professor Hilligus, we'll move on to you. We always hear that if young voters turn out in large enough numbers, that there are enough of them to sway elections. Do you have any clues to the kind of level of young voter turnout that we can expect in this election?
Sure. I mean, that storyline is once again making its way through the media that young people could be decisive. At the same time, we also know that young people participate at much lower rates, even with historic turnout rates in 2020, right? 50% of young people stayed at home. And early indications are that we are not seeing kind of the same level of participation. So looking at registration rates across the country, most of the states are currently lagging where they were in 2020, exceptions being like Michigan is one of the swing states, but of course they have moved to automatic voter registration, and so that is surely part of it. We have also seen some both changes in the laws that had made it more difficult for young people to register and to vote. So for instance, getting rid of student IDs in Idaho. In North Carolina, just the process of absentee voting is far more complicated now. And so I expect to see young voters more likely to have to cast provisional ballots. And we also know from previous studies that the provisional ballots cast by young people are more likely to be rejected. So, I think they're it's still a little bit of time, but increasingly what we're seeing is that state legislatures that are controlled by Democrats are making it easier for young people to register and vote in those states. Republican legislatures are making it harder for young people to register and vote. And the rules of the game are such that young people are disproportionately impacted. And this, this could be part of it. We could also talk later, if there's interest, about kind of levels of enthusiasm in this election cycle, about the candidates and the motivating issues, and especially some of the headlines out there about gender gap, if anyone is interested.
Absolutely. We'll definitely be following up on that. Thank you. For now, we'll move on to Professor Hildebrand. Here in North Carolina, there are obviously all the congressional races or the in the House are all up, but there have been some changes and accusations of gerrymandering regarding the maps. Can you talk a little bit about kind of what races you're watching there and some of the things that may have changed in North Carolina congressionally since the last election?
Happy to, and one could be forgiven for forgetting that there are congressional races in North Carolina this year because there's not a lot of drama, with the exception of one district, the first district in the northeastern part of the state, where the incumbent, Don Davis, is taking on challenger Lori Buckholt in a district that has been traditionally Democratic but trending toward Republicans. The other 13 congressional districts in the state are fairly safely Republican or Democratic. And that's a result of the congressional map that was drawn last year by the General Assembly after the state Supreme Court reversed its earlier precedent and gave its blessing to partisan gerrymandering. And so the map that North Carolinians are currently living under, which has 7 Democrats and 7 Republicans representing the state in the U.S. House, is being replaced by a map that will have at least 10, possibly 11 Republican seats and 3 or 4 Democratic seats, which makes it, just from a mathematical perspective, the most extreme partisan gerrymander in the country, but also a map that has very little competition, again, outside of that first district. So I'll be watching that race. I'll be watching the other races to see how far ahead of or behind the sort of top of the ticket that these individual candidates run, but I'm not expecting a lot of drama in the congressional map on Election Day.
Thank you, Professor Hildebrand. Appreciate that. Professor McCorkle, the governor's race in North Carolina has drawn national attention, and in a lot of quarters seems to be done and dusted. But what is your take on that race, and what effects you think it might have elsewhere on the ballot?
Yeah. Well, you might want to boldly predict a Stein victory over Mark Robinson, and perhaps a big one. The caution is that the polling for Roy Cooper in 2020 in his reelection bid, he was winning by double digits in most of the polls and only ended up winning by 5. So the Stein campaign is definitely on guard for not believing the polling. But unless Donald Trump has a big victory here in North Carolina and can somehow drag Mark Robinson over the finish line, in the absence of that, the Robinson campaign has really collapsed. There's been no ads for Mark Robinson in the last 3 weeks, even though he is the star of almost every Democratic ad. So get to your point about whether there's reverse coattails that hurts Trump, probably not significantly, but even a couple thousand votes can matter in North Carolina. Where the real damage might be done is in the down ballot races. And one of the interesting things in the down ballot races, and what I mean by that is lieutenant governor, superintendent of education. We have a long ballot here in North Carolina. Is that most of the Republicans running with Mark Robinson are as MAGA and as radical as Mark Robinson in many respects. So there could be some real damage to the Republican ticket, and might, again, unless there's a big Trump victory here, might lead to the breaking of the supermajority in the state legislative races, simply because Stein wins so big and political gravity takes place, and Democrats do it well enough in general to break the supermajority. So a lot of ifs, ands, and buts, but probably we're looking at some sort of Democratic victory at the gubernatorial level. How big or how small really determines a lot of the other races.
Thank you, Professor McCorkle, and thank you to all of our panelists for those opening comments. We've got a lot to dig into here, and we've had some questions submitted in advance, but I'll just let everybody know you can post questions in the Q&A at any time, and we'll sift through those and get to as many of them as we can. I'm going to press on with some of the questions we already had. Professor Haney, coming back to you, besides North Carolina, what states are you going to be watching closely on election night, and what are kind of the things you're looking out for?
Again, I mentioned Georgia earlier. I think that'll be a key state to watch. As Georgia goes, so goes the election, I think. We may know, could be a long night, could be a couple of long nights with this election. But if there's a call in Georgia early on, I think we'll know quite a bit about what's going to happen nationally. And again, I mentioned North Carolina. I put in that same category. And one of the things I will watch, I mean, Mac referred to this, is what's happening with the governor's race in North Carolina, and seeing what those returns look like as they come in and what they might mean for the presidential race. I agree that there may not be any sort of lone coattails, if any at all, but I'm wondering if there'll be folks who will not show up and vote because of the Republican ticket. The Robertson been on the ticket, the other MAGA folks on the ticket, and there are many Republicans who that doesn't fit well for, and I'm just wondering if they will sit out and not show up, and what that means for the presidential race.
Sure, thank you very much. Professor 𝐅𝐸𝐥𝐥𝐥, you talked about some of the law changes here in North Carolina. And of course, one of the new ones is the voter ID law, which hasn't been in place for a presidential election in this state before. Based on early voting turnout and other factors, do you expect that to be a significant factor? Do people seem to have accepted that that's a big change and that it's kind of already being assimilated into voters' approaches? Or what's your sense of that?
I think it's important to remember that while the empirical research suggests that, the impact of a voter ID is relatively small, in a close election that can matter, and who is being impacted also matters. And so it's for the particular groups. Looking at the early voting and the absentee ballots, there, I think it is quite hard to compare apples to apples to 2020, just because, in a pandemic, we saw so many more people that were voting absentee ballot. And also there's been a fundamental change in messaging from Republicans. And so we're seeing a much larger percentage of Republicans who are voting early and absentee. And so, we want to just be careful in terms of, making comparisons and making predictions out of those numbers. With respect to the voter ID law in particular, I think the election officials are working very hard for those who are coming in early to process cures. And so, in terms of where things, really shake out in terms of how many how many provisional ballots will be rejected and how many people are turned away for voter ID, I'm not sure that, we have a great guess as to exactly what that number will be, but I suspect there will be other issues that are much bigger and more consequential.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. Professor Hildebrand, we had a question come in through WRAL that has a new poll this morning showing 47% support for Harris and 47% support for Trump, with 2% indicating they would support a third-party candidate. Can you speak at all to the kind of influence of third-party candidates on a North Carolina ballot presidentially, whether it's ever made much of a difference and whether you think it could make a difference this time?
Well, the short answer is that, yes, it could make a difference. There was a contest over access to the ballot by third-party candidates, especially for Robert F. Kennedy, who wanted on the ballot and then wanted off again, and for Cornel West. And I hesitate to use the term normal because we don't really know what that means anymore. In a normal year, historically speaking, the 2, 3, 4 points that a third-party candidate might secure, might not make or break the difference. But in an election where every poll has the candidates within about 2 points of being tied. That's true for the WRAL poll. That's true for that's true for just about every other poll that's polled North Carolina in the last month. Then at the margins, a third-party candidate could matter, just as voting rules impacting young people could matter, just as Hurricane Helene and its impact could matter, just as Mark Robinson and his impact could matter, right? There are a lot of issues like this that could matter at the margins that could add up to be decisive. And I would certainly put the small but potentially significant number of votes that a third-party candidate secures in North Carolina on that list.
Absolutely, thank you. Professor McCorkle, I want to move on to you. I know we'll be losing you at 11:30, so I wanted to give you a chance to kind of weigh in on some of these things. You mentioned earlier about some of the other down ballot races in North Carolina. I was wondering if you could expand a little bit, specifically, the Attorney General race, the Superintendent race. I think these are races that in another year might have gotten more attention because there's been a lot of some interesting stuff there, but it's been overwhelmed by obviously the presidential race and some of the controversy about the gubernatorial race. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of the other statewide races in North Carolina that people should know.
Yeah, well, the one that's been the most controversial is further down the ballots, the state superintendent of education, and Michelle Morrow, the Republican candidate who actually surprisingly unseated the Republican incumbent superintendent of state education, a quite conservative Republican, was beaten by a woman, Michelle Morrow, who I think would easily agree that she is a MAGA candidate. She was there on she was in Washington on January 6th. Has called for the public execution of President Obama, President Biden, and Governor Cooper, and is really more outrageous politically in her statements than Mark Robinson. In the lieutenant governor's race, you have a not so well-known MAGA Republican, Hal Weatherman, running against Rachel Hunt, former Governor Jim Hunt's daughter, and state senator. So that's an interesting race, but I don't think has gotten much play. And so as far as I can tell, there's not much differentiation yet. And then the Attorney General's race, we have two congressmen from the Charlotte area running against each other, Jeff Jackson and Dan Bishop. And Bishop was a state legislator and was the author of the notorious bathroom bill, the HB2, that got the Republicans so much in trouble. So that might actually increase some turnout in Charlotte because that's such a disputed race. We really don't know much about these down ballot races. Some recent polling has indicated that people might be getting more aware of Michelle Morrow and how controversial she is. But that's the real question. Will Mark Robinson take down a lot of these other Republicans and people will see them as a whole to vote against? Or will they see Mark Robinson as an exception and the Republicans and the conservative independents keep on voting for Trump and the other Republicans?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Professor McCorkle. Professor Hillegas, I want to come back to you. Obviously, all of this with the election barely a week out is kind of prognosticating, talking about what may happen. But there are a lot of difficulties in interpreting early poll numbers and these kind of patterns in general. Can you talk a little bit about why it's so difficult to kind of make comparisons, say, when we're looking at early voting numbers and trying to speculate on what may happen when all the votes are cast?
Sure. I mean, as I alluded to, number one is that, 2020 was really different because of the pandemic and also because of the messaging for Republicans to not cast their votes early or by absentee ballot. And so what we're seeing is that there's just a really different pattern in terms of who is showing up early this cycle, since there's been a change in messaging, since there's no longer fears about showing up at an early voting site. Additionally, there's been major changes in exactly how absentee ballots are going to be processed. So so many of the states are now having to receive those absentee ballots by election day. And so, just what we're going to be looking at in terms of early returns is going to be really different. And so I think it's really important that journalists do not allow for kind of early patterns and comparisons of early patterns to 2020 to signal what's going to likely be the outcome of the race, because that comparison is no longer, I think, quite as informative as we might have thought. And so, I think that there's going to be an effort in focusing on early returns to be able to, and then are the late breakers going to be one way or the other, and in those sides saying, pointing to evidence of election integrity related to these patterns. And I think it's really important that journalists kind of make clear how the rules of the game have kind of shifted in interpreting those.
Absolutely, thank you. And with that, in mind, Professor Haney, we had a question come into the chat about what you make of the partisan breakdown of who has turned out so far. Apparently there's a slight GOP edge and a large amount of unaffiliated voters in North Carolina. Do you think that we can draw any conclusions from that based on what Professor Hillegas was just saying?
I think we have to be careful. I think Sunshine has it exactly right. If you're going to compare to 2020, it's very tricky to do so because that was an unusual circumstance where many, many more people voted other than showing up at the polls on election day, voted early, voted by mail. And so it's hard to compare the two election cycles. So I don't make much of that at this stage. I'll see what the numbers look like after the early voting period is over in a few days, and that'll tell us a little bit more what might be out there.
Absolutely, thank you. And again, I encourage our panelists to weigh in if you have additional thoughts to add based on what some of your colleagues are saying. Professor Hildebrand,
may I do so? I have a question before Mac, I know, has to jump
please.
off in a minute. So I have a question about the nastiness of the campaign. The national campaign has turned particularly nasty in the last, week or so. And might that nastiness blend in with what's happening in North Carolina, right? And will voters make a distinction between, what President Trump and the national campaign is doing and what's happening with some of the folks you described early on? Might that blend in and have a cumulative effect, right? That voters in North Carolina might be just turned off and see all this as one kettle of fish, the same thing, and be turned off to Republicans in general?
Are you asking me?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the conventional strategy for Donald Trump as the challenger would be in the final 10 days being calm, cool and collected.
Right.
And he is not only not that way usually, even more so than in 16 and 20, he seems hell-bent on presenting himself as the bad boy and the agent of chaos, and people better get used to it, wanting an ultimate mandate. And so he is risking a lot here. That Madison Square Garden rally with the bizarre comments about Puerto Rican people and Latino people in general makes no political sense except in the world of Donald Trump. So, yeah, I think that that's a real question, because you would think that Trump would now be kind of consolidating victory, reaching out to moderate voters. And he seems to be doing the exact opposite. So we'll just, again, it's a risky strategy, but that seems to be Donald Trump.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Thank you both for that. Professor Hildebrand, can I come to you? And again, this is open to anybody who would like to weigh in. We've had a question from a couple of people about, and again, within the context of what Professor Hillegas said about the danger of doing too much interpretation of early numbers, but that apparently we're seeing lower early turnout among Black voters in North Carolina than in the past. Is there anything that any of our panelists think may be driving that? Do they think that negative ads by the Harris campaign could be affecting it? What are your thoughts on that? Starting with you, Professor Hildebrand.
Yeah, and thanks, Laura, for that question. And just to add my 2 cents on the early vote numbers, because we kind of go through this every election, especially as early votings become such an important part of our election period, as important in many states as Election Day itself. But in addition to the peculiarities of 2020, we have to keep in mind that a lot of the evidence shows that in-person early voting, people who are most likely to vote in-person early voting are those who would also be most likely to vote on Election Day. And so the question really is not who is voting now, it's whether these voters would vote at all if they weren't voting early, right? In other words, whether a committed voter votes early or votes on Election Day is less of an important question than the question of whether a sporadic voter, a new voter voting for the first time during early voting. And so I think we should be cautious for all those reasons about overinterpreting early voting returns. But I will say that what early voting returns do is to clarify the path to victory for each campaign, right? So in North Carolina now, we do know that Republicans are voting at historically high levels in early voting, that Black voters, as Laura says, are voting at lower levels. And what that means, if you're the Harris campaign, is that as we get closer to Election Day, if that trend holds, it puts a lot of pressure on the Election Day turnout operation of Harris and the Democratic campaign to turn out Black voters, for example, to make up for that lower voting, or to turn out base Democratic voters to make up for the higher voting of Republicans, whereas Republicans may have banked more votes than they have in the past, which leads to a different strategy for Election Day. And so I'm not raising alarm bells about the turnout so far. But again, with each day that passes as we get closer to the election, the sort of path to victory becomes clearer and clearer. I'll leave it to colleagues to speculate as to why the turnout numbers are where they are so far. We'll just leave it at that for now.
One other pattern that I think is potentially worth noting in the early voting, where I'm hesitant to really talk about, which side is advantaged by overall numbers, is that looking at Western North Carolina, there, we are seeing, rates that are coming in where it looks in most cases where there aren't significant impacts, with the exception of Buncombe County and some dark blue areas that are still, don't have water and harder hit areas. And so, the question that many people had wondered is, will the hurricane, hurt Democrats or hurt Republicans? In a lot of these early numbers, it looks like they're largely on track with impacts actually on the Democrats. And I think the question then becomes, are dislocated voters, so those who were in the hard hit areas of Asheville, that may have dislocated to Durham or Charlotte because they need to get their kids in school, are they figuring out what they need to do in order to cast a ballot? And that's I think one of the remaining things that we need to see from these early voting numbers.
You're gonna drop off.
Thank you, Professor McCorkle. Appreciate your time and insight as always. Professor Haney, I wanted to come back to you. We've had another question here in the chat about the Republican presidential campaign's increased efforts to mobilize young conservative men through non-traditional strategies like attending tailgates and speaking on podcasts. Do you have any insight into what do you think might be driving that strategy, given that that's traditionally one of the lowest voter turnout blocks that we see?
I think, in part, the answer was in the question, right? So that's one of these low turnout demographics that will determine when they turn out to favor Republican candidates. So if you can drive up support among this group, that helps. And I think in these close elections, they need to find the votes wherever they can. I think it's potentially a fertile ground for votes for the Republican candidates.
Absolutely. Thank you. And Professor 𝐅𝐸𝐥𝐥𝐵, I want to come back and start with you, but I want everybody's perspective on this too. Polling, ever since 2016, polling was obviously an earthquake for a lot of political observers. And at the time, it seemed like all the polls were wrong. And so polls have had increased scrutiny since then. And of course, polling has changed an awful lot over the last decade and more, as people have less home phones and traditional ways that pollers reach people. Can you talk a little bit about what polling looks like in 2024 and exactly how much we should be kind of investing in it as we look at what might happen next week?
Yeah, I think the issue is that we are just polls are not a tool that are sufficient for doing the work that we want them to do in a close election. They just aren't. Even if the methods were perfect, you are still going to run into the fact that we don't know who's going to turn out. And so the scientific value of a poll is if you take a random sample from the population, you can generalize from that sample to the population with a margin of error. However, we don't know the population because we don't know who's going to turn out. And so pollsters have to make assumptions. There is also now documented that Trump voters are particularly hard to reach, or less likely to respond when they do get reached. And so different pollsters are kind of confronting and dealing with that in different ways. A lot are waiting on 2020 vote. Again, that's making a very big assumption about who's going to show up, and then what you do with those who didn't vote in 2020. Young people and minority citizens are the very hardest to get into polls. And so, a lot of headlines recently were made over the gender gap among young voters, that young voters were going to break for Trump and young women are breaking from Harris. That finding has not been replicated in polls. While there is a gender gap at every age level, on average, young men are as liberal and is more, as likely to support Harris in most polls as even some older women. And so that polling result, I suspect, is largely a function of how many young voters they had in their sample and how they were weighted. And so I think we just have to be really cautious. But again, it's not just that, polling methods are more difficult. It's that in a close election, it is harder to, use polls as a useful tool in prediction. That said, there sometimes is useful information. So, for instance, seeing Robinson's trailing of Trump, right? That can still be useful information even if we don't have a lot of confidence that the exact percentage is something that we take to the bank.
Let me add to that, I looking at some early polls coming out of Georgia and trying to make sense out of who they were sampling for their poll. And you saw a Black sample that was much smaller percentage than the electorate in Georgia. So, to me, I thought, okay, I can't make any sense out of this because this sample is a skewed sample. It's not this kind of sample that you can make that a professional would make any sort of reasonable conclusions from, given how small the Black part of that sample was. It was underneath the percentage of voters in the state of Georgia. And I found that troubling. So there are a lot of bad polls out there. Again, it's hard to reach people these days. When I get called, if I don't know you on my cell number, I don't answer. Right? And I suspect many people are like that, given the concerns we have about all kinds of things when you ask to click on a link or to answer a phone call. So it's harder to do and harder to make sense out of when it's done.
On that point, I would just make one more point, and that is that we don't see a lot of polling going on in the states where they're not swing states. And so, the people who are trying to be reached in these swing states are getting inundated, right, with calls and text messages. And so there is a real, selection bias into who is choosing to answer the phone and to respond. And so, where pollsters are essentially, by waiting to 2020, weighting down the Harris advantage, it's unclear, right, if that difference in enthusiasm might actually be meaningful in terms of turnout rates. Those are all of it is guess, all of it is kind of an assumption that different pollsters are making in terms of, what results are going to get presented. A recent analysis by Josh Clinton at Vanderbilt showed that just changing how you're doing weighting can change the results by as much as 8 percentage points. And that was for me just like perfect evidence of essentially the intuition that I carry with me. And that is that margin of error that, plus or minus 3 percentage points that most polls are reporting, you need to at least double it in trying to make sense of any polling numbers.
Thank you both for that perspective. And before we move on, one kind of philosophical question that probably doesn't have an easy answer. Given that the problems with polling and the problems with generating accurate polling are much greater than they have been in recent years or previous to the last decade or so. But political campaigns are so dependent upon polling. Polling's everywhere in the media, and political observers watch for it. Do you think that we're just essentially stuck with an imperfect model, or do you think that there could be over time more of an acknowledgement that polling is such an imperfect science that it's no longer really serving a purpose, and that we'll see less of it? I realize that's an enormous question.
I'll take a first stab at this one since I didn't speak to the others, and just by saying, that I think Sunshine's exactly right, that while the methodology of polling is under significant strain from technological and other changes and response rates and all of that, that the fundamental problem is not so much that polls are, inherently flawed or useless. It's that the way we consume them, by we, I mean media, of course, I mean political culture, the way they are consumed is asking too much of them, right? And that if we take them in context as a measure of an imperfect measure of opinion at a point in time and not a prediction of the future, then they can be extremely valuable. And in fact, that they're one of the most valuable ways we have for inferring what the public actually thinks on an issue, because there's really no other way that we could do that. But the problem where we get into tricky territory is when we start predicting the outcome based on polling, or when we overinterpret very minor changes within the margin of error in individual polls as constituting some major shift in the electorate or a major trend. And the final thing I'll say on that is just that I think we're at the point in this election where there's very little additional changes in the polls that probably are meaningful in terms of the outcome. There are certainly things on the ground happening that are meaningful in terms of the outcome. The get out the vote campaigns. There are certainly things that the candidates might do or say that for those very few voters who are making up their mind on how to vote, or the much larger number of voters who are making up their mind about whether to vote, maybe those things like Trump's rally in Madison Square Garden matter. But I don't think we can expect to see much of that in the polls at this point. So you can safely assume that the race is a toss-up in most swing states, that it could go either way, and then we'll see what the outcome is on Election Day.
And one of the things that I looked at, in particularly the last couple of weeks of the campaign, I looked less at polls and I watched where the candidates take themselves, where they go, right? Where they're doing the campaigning. And Sunshine, a question for you in this regard is that it seems to me over the last couple of election cycles, at least, the internal campaign polls have been better, that the candidates seem to have a better sense of where things stand than the national polls that we see in the press and that are often reported, that the internal campaigning polls seem to be better. Is that just a misperception on my part?
No, but I mean, there's different goals, and not to pick on the media, given that there are guests today, but media polls are oftentimes looking for a headline, right, about who's ahead and who's behind, whereas the internal polls are really focused on a fundamentally different objective. And so they're spending a lot more money on their polling operations. They are, not getting them out of the field quite as fast unless it's message testing. So they're not as close comparison. That said, the internal polls are often, they also are a little bit more kind of like question driven, like how are we doing with a particular subgroup, and so when you go with a particular hypothesis, then you're more likely to kind of check, are the assumptions of my sample, good or not. That said, even internal polls are facing many of the methodological challenges and the limitations in interpretation, and so are also leaning heavily on voter registration data and other sources of information beyond polling numbers.
Thanks to all of you for very nuanced takes on what was a very kind of blunt and clumsy question for me. We've got a few more things that I want to make sure that we cover before we wrap up here. Professor Hildebrand, I want to come back to you. There is a constitutional amendment on the ballot in North Carolina about the language around requiring people to be a citizen in order to vote. Is that something that you see as being kind of much of a factor in the election, as we've got, the presidential race and like so much noise about so many of the races? Is there anything you can kind of say about that amendment? Do you think it's much of a factor here?
So the amendment that is on the ballot, and just as a reminder, North Carolina does not have a citizen initiative process. So the only way that an initiative gets on the ballot is through the General Assembly. And this amendment would affirm that only citizens 18 years or older, although the language is a little ambiguous on that, only citizens 18 years or older are allowed to vote in North Carolina. The current law already prohibits non-citizens from voting in North Carolina, and the actual incidence of non-citizen voting is extraordinarily low. And an investigation by the Board of Elections recently found that something like 9 non-citizens had voted out of the many millions in the North Carolina electorate, and so it's essentially statistically zero, which leads me to conclude that the motivation of the General Assembly majority in putting this on the ballot was primarily political, both as a way to generate enthusiasm, potentially turnout among Republican voters who are concerned about non-citizens generally, and perhaps non-citizen voting specifically, but also possibly to sow some confusion among other voters. There's been a lot of concern among voting rights groups that the language could discourage people who are naturalized citizens from voting if they sort of hear that there's this effect, sort of a restriction on non-citizen voting rights. And so there's a potential for some confusion and perhaps a suppressive effect. I do not personally think that the effect of this amendment in and of itself is going to be particularly large. I think the voters most likely to be motivated by it are probably those who are already planning to turn out. On the other hand, as I said earlier, in a state that is truly on the knife's edge, in which every marginal factor could decide the election, at least in statewide races, then I would put the amendment in the category of marginal factors that could possibly be decisive. And so you never know.
Thank you very much for that. I can say, as a naturalized US citizen myself, I certainly intend to vote in this election.
Thanks.
So a couple of other things I just wanted to cover before, although Professor Hilligan, I saw you unmute yourself. Was there an additional point you wanted to make there?
Well, only just to say that what we're seeing is kind of systematic efforts to shape a narrative, and that this is part of that, right? That and so we're seeing this with respect to kind of election integrity type of issues, election fraud issues, but also in messaging towards young voters, where there have been, particularly around like residency requirements and so on, some systematic efforts to both sow some confusion, but also to intimidate, with messaging that like is not really relevant to the specific rules of who is it doesn't change who is eligible to vote or not, but it really is about a narrative about what's about election integrity.
Sure, thank you. And you, I was going to come to you next for this question that you kind of just touched on a little bit there. We know that America is hyper polarized at the moment, and and has been growing more so. It seems like by the year over the last decade. Do you see any evidence that that polarization could depress turnout, especially amongst younger voters who may be, just kind of sick of the system, sick of people just focusing on throwing out insults and attacks rather than focusing on the issues? Could that be a driver in turnout? I'm interested in everybody's takes on that.
Sure. I mean, there's actually some competing evidence, because on the one hand, right, when people are angry, they're more likely to act, but when they're sad and depressed, they are less likely to act. So in part, it's this question of, what people's response to that polarization and the state of American politics is. There, certainly was some sense, there is some sense of like fatigue over elections and a pox on both houses. For young people, the specific pattern that I would point to is the fact that young people are particularly likely to say that they do not want to vote as a partisan, like they don't want to vote party line. What that means in practice is that they oftentimes hold themselves to a much higher standard as to what they think they need to know to be a good voter. And so poll results suggest that young people will kind of self-suppress, right? That they will stay home because they feel like they haven't done enough and they don't want to just vote party line. Whereas old people are happy to vote party line, right? Happy to vote even if they don't necessarily feel like they have learned everything they needed to know about every single race that we're being asked to vote on.
I'm going to add to this that I think, I think Sunshine has it exactly right about younger voters, but there's some evidence, right, to suggest that there may be a single issue that they know quite a bit about that may drive them to the polls. Abortion being one this election cycle. I think the rhetoric and language around transsexual folks and lesbian, gays, and homosexuals. I think young folks, the generation that we teach on campus, have this. I don't think plays well. This kind of message doesn't play well. It makes them angry, to use the language Sunshine. And I think it may be a motivating factor for folks to go out and vote. Some of these types of issues that are out there in this particular election cycle.
That said, the other kind of pattern is that the concerns about Gaza war are potentially suppressing because again, they are not happy with either of the candidates on that issue. And so when it comes to Carrie's point, that young voters are more likely to be single issue voters rather than kind of leaning on their party loyalties. And the big question, and it's one of the things that polls can be really useful for, is instead of focusing on, do you support one candidate or the other, getting a real sense of the issues that the public cares about, and being able to see, how that lines up with what the candidates are talking about or not. And that's going to be quite relevant. I mean, one of the things that we are now seeing the Harris campaign really shift to talk about abortion, but there was quite a chunk of time where, the eating cats and dogs comment really focused attention on the issue of immigration. And that, and Trump as a person, rather than on the issues that might be particularly effective at mobilizing single issue voters.
And just to add to that briefly, relating back to the third party question we had earlier, right? If Jill Stein, for example, wins even 1.5%, 2% of the North Carolina electorate, and if that win is fueled in part by young voters disaffected with the two major parties, then that could be decisive in North Carolina, where again, Donald Trump won by 1.4 percentage points in 2020, and it could be even closer this year.
Gotcha. Thank you, everybody. We're going to be wrapping up here in just a few minutes, but I wanted to get through another couple of questions and looking at an election night and beyond. Professor Haney, you've talked about a focus on Georgia for you personally. What's your take on efforts there in particular to give county officials more ability to challenge certification of results? Do you think that could be a factor, and does that concern you?
Not really. I think the Republicans who are in authority and in positions of authority and power have been resistant to some of these efforts. So I'm not worried about Georgia. I think Georgia's on guard. I think we learned a lot from the last cycle. I think state election officials around the country and the parties themselves will be ready for all kinds of shenanigans or attempts to complicate things after the vote has been cast. So I'm not worried about Georgia in that regard.
Absolutely. Any of our other panelists kind of want to weigh in, or anything you'll be looking for kind of after the election, whatever the result of the presidential election may be, the period between between the election and the inauguration, especially given that if President Trump said he may challenge the results if he does not win the election, but of course this time he would be doing it not as president as he did in 2020. How do you think that might play out differently than it did 4 years ago if that's how things happen?
I think we need to be prepared for that fact. All of the signals are lining up for challenges to be made in terms of just things that are already being raised in the courts in terms of should particular groups of voters have been able to cast ballots versus not, what voter registration rolls and maintenance looks like. And so, I think there's a pretty organized effort to cast some doubt on elections. I mean, we are already seeing pretty explicit messages about kicking things to the North Carolina state legislature, and I was relieved to see that a bipartisan condemnation of suggestions that the hurricanes in North Carolina mean that the state legislature get to decide who the state takes. So I think it's incredibly important to get those bipartisan messages out there about the security and integrity of the elections, because there will certainly be groups and individuals who are looking for opportunities to challenge that.
I totally agree with Sunshine there. And I mean, it's really extraordinary in some ways that we're even having this conversation, right? Almost 4 years since January 6th, and given everything that's transpired. But based on what Trump has said, based on the way he has turned the Republican National Committee into essentially a well-funded network of lawyers to challenge the election results, there's really no doubt that if it is close and appears that Harris has won, that Trump will try to challenge the results in whatever way he can. Given how close this election appears to be shaping up to be, it is very difficult to envision a scenario where Harris's victory is so large that it's not subject to those challenges. And as recently as the other day in Madison Square Garden, Trump's kind of given a wink and a nod to the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, saying he's got a secret and we should just wait and see what his secret is. So even though Congress has tightened the Electoral Count Act, has kind of closed some of the pathways through which a president could challenge the results, there's still plenty of ground in the system we have for a losing candidate to cause trouble. And if enough trouble is caused at the margins, that could be decisive. And so Sunshine's absolutely right. We need to be preparing for this. We need to be calling these attempts what they are, which are in some cases attempts to subvert the will of voters. And I'll leave it at that.
Absolutely. Thank you very much there. We are about to wrap up here. We're almost at time. The one final thought I would be interested to get if anybody wants to weigh in on this. I know we're obviously loath to make predictions this close to the election, but would anybody like to speculate on the likelihood that we will actually have a presidential election result on the night of the election? Or do we think that given the closeness in certain battleground states that we expect everybody to be on hold for a day or even more before we get a result? Any thoughts on that?
I'll jump in with that. I think we will have a result election night. Again, I don't think it'll go unchallenged, but I think we had 4 years of experience, so we know what those challenges might be. And I think the system is better prepared to deal with those challenges as they come.
Harry is more optimistic than I am. I'm planning on going to sleep and not trying to wait up for it.
Likewise.
Well, there you go. I can't think of a better place to end it. Thank you ever so much, everybody, for joining us. Thank you to our panelists, Mac McCorkle, Asher Hildebrand, Sunshine Hilligus, and Kerry Haney. Hope everybody found this briefing worthwhile. If you'd like to be added to the list to receive notifications about future briefings, you can email us at dukenews@duke.edu. In the meantime, please make sure you vote and have a great day. Thank you, everybody.